This is my kitchen table and also my filing system. Over much of the past 3 decades, I've been an investor. The highest calling of mankind, I've often thought, was private equity. And then I started interviewing.
While I watch your interviews, I know how to do some interviewing.
I've learned in doing my interviews how leaders make it to the top.
I asked him how much he wanted. He said $250. I said fine. I didn't negotiate with him, and I did no due diligence.
I have something I'd like to sell.
And how they stay there.
You don't feel inadequate now because being only the second wealthiest man in the world, is that right?
In recent decades, one of the most important figures in Wall Street has been John Mack. He led Morgan Stanley for many years and led it through the financial crisis of 2007-2008. John rose from modest circumstances in North Carolina to become a dominant figure on Wall Street for quite some time. I sat down with John recently to discuss his life story and also what he sees as the future of Wall Street. So you spent more than 50 years on Wall Street, and probably the most difficult time was during this 2007-2008 recession where Morgan Stanley came close to going under. Was that the most difficult time of your career?
No question about it. I mean, we were on the brink of going out of business.
And you thought you had a good cash reserve for a while, but then all of a sudden people started pulling cash out. Your cash reserves went down. How close did you come to actually going bankrupt?
Well, we were very close, David, to the point that Tim Geithner at the Fed was trying to get us to sell to Jamie Dimon at the time. And he kept saying, that's what I want you to do. So I called Jamie and I said, look, Geithner's all over me. He says, you'll buy the firm. He said, I don't want your firm. I said, well, go tell Geithner that. And he said, John, if you forced me to do it, I wouldn't pay you $2 a share. So that made it easy on me. I was not going to listen to them. And as a result, we called our board in, and we're thinking we're going to go out of business.
At one point, you're on a phone call with Ben Bernanke, the chairman of the Fed,
Right.
Hank Paulson, Secretary of Treasury, and Tim Geithner, the head of the New York Fed, and they say you should file for bankruptcy.
Right.
And you slam the phone down on them. Was
Yeah.
that easy to do?
For me, it was easy to do. I mean, thank God I left out some 4-letter words. I said, I'll take the firm down first, and I hung up on him.
Okay.
So I can't tell you why I did it, because in my gut, it was the wrong thing to do.
So now, after your retirement, you decided to write a book, which is a very good book I've read, Up
Thank
Close and All In, about your life story. So
Right.
how hard is it to sit down and write about your life and go through the good and the bad things? Did it take you a long time to do this? And did you ever say, why did I agree to do this?
No, I enjoyed sitting down and working with the person who works with me on the book. Look, I have a lot of memories, a lot of things that I did that in talking with him, it came up of other things that I had done. So I enjoyed it. I got along really well with my writer, and Linda Coleman was just terrific. And we had fun doing it, so I enjoyed doing the book.
So at the end of the book, you say something that I found to be surprising. You talked about the fact that you've recently been diagnosed with some cognitive impairment,
Right.
which you say could lead to Alzheimer's.
Correct.
And why did you put that in the book? You didn't need to put that in.
No, I didn't. Christy and I talked about it, and she said, look, John, you're always upfront with people. You're writing this book. Tell people the truth. Tell them you're having some issues. So we talked about it, and I agreed it's the right thing to do. I mean, I didn't put it in there for sympathy. I didn't put it in there for, come over and give me a hug. I just think my personality has been upfront. I tell people what's going on. I did that when I ran Morgan Stanley. I did it at Credit Suisse, even though Swiss didn't like me very much for doing it. I did it at Credit Suisse. That's who I am. I'm upfront. I tell people what's going on. Look, it happens.
You say that maybe you thought it came from your football injuries, or
Right.
maybe you fell off an ATV.
Right.
But in hindsight, is it more of a genetic kind of thing, do you think, or the doctors don't really know?
Well, the doctors don't know it's genetic. I mean, my mother did have Alzheimer's. I just think you need information. Look, I hope my cognitive skills last for a long time, but life's life, and just live it. And I don't think trying to hide things. If you and I did know each other like we know each other and go out to dinner, I don't want you to say, John, you just told me that 3 minutes ago. I want to put a little warning out there, give me a break. I may repeat myself. And I cover myself by saying, I may have already told you this.
Now, Christy is your wife of more than 50 years as well?
49 years. It'll
49
be 50
years.
in November.
Okay, so where did you meet her?
I met her through Charlie Rose. So Charlie Rose and I were at Duke University. He was a couple of years ahead of me. And he had moved to New York, and I was in New York working at Smith Barney at the time. And he called me up and said, you know, my wife's sister's coming up. We'd like you to, you know, take her out. I thought about it a little bit and got a date for Friday night and called him back and said, okay, we'll go out Saturday night. And I go up to their apartment on 96th Street. Mary was a beautiful woman. And Christy walked in. She took my breath away. Not only beautiful, but had a great smile. She was very warm, very friendly. If it wasn't love at first sight, it was pretty close.
Let's talk about your background. So you grew up in North Carolina, but
Yes.
your grandfather immigrated from Lebanon, is that
Correct.
right? But why did he go to North Carolina? Was there a big Lebanese community there, or did he intend to go to another place?
There was a big Lebanese community in South Carolina. And he was going to go to Marion, South Carolina when he got off Ellis Island, and he ended up in Marion, North Carolina. He stayed the night in the train depot. No one came to pick him up. So finally a conductor said, pulled him on the train and took him to Charlotte, North Carolina on that train. And there was a Arabic family around a coffee shop at the train station. And they talked about the mix-up. They gave him a job. He started washing dishes. Then he became a peddler. Then he went back and got the rest of his family. And they'd made enough money to get a wagon. And they went in the countryside selling cloth, sewing materials, shoes, stuff like that. And then that evolved into John Mack and Sons. John Mack was my grandfather's name. And it was a clothing department store. And my father, who was an entrepreneur, decided he wanted to be totally on his own. And he started a wholesale grocery business.
And so they wanted you to go in that business at some point?
I don't think my father did. My mother was a very strong force. She only wanted to be a doctor. And I really didn't want to be a doctor. My father was laid back, and my mother was really aggressive. It was a great combination.
So you were a high school football star?
Well, I don't know about a star, but I was a good football player.
I thought you were
yes.
All-State. That's
I was.
pretty good.
All right, All-State. You've done your homework.
Okay, so All-State. So you get a scholarship to Duke University to play
Correct.
football. And what happened to your career at Duke?
Well, I thought I was a good football player until I got to Duke. They have some great players. And then in my sophomore year, I was a redshirt for 1 year. Then I was on like the second team, but I broke C6 in my neck. I cracked it. And what happened, every time I would tackle someone, my left arm and side would go dead. So Frank Bassett, who's one of the orthopedic surgeons who used to be at Duke, called the AD and said, this young man's football career is over. He has a bona fide injury. He cannot play football any longer. So that ended my football career. But once you're on scholarship, I still had to work there. So I was a manager, getting towels and setting up trips when they go play, one of the teams in Florida or one of the teams in the Big Ten.
So when you graduated, did you say, I want to go to Wall Street and be the CEO of Morgan Stanley?
No, when I graduated, I needed one course to finish Duke University. My scholarship had expired, so I got a job in a local brokerage firm called First Securities in North Carolina. So that got me involved in the securities business, and there was a lady there named Fannie Mitchell, and maybe you remember, she ran the job placement office at Duke University. So when the recruiters would come down, she would say, there's one guy you got to meet, it's John Mack. And I would meet these recruiters and got a number of job offers. And then I decided that I liked the securities business. Smith Barney wanted to open an office at that time in Atlanta. They offered me a job and I took it.
You went to Smith Barney. What did you do there? Were you like a registered investment rep
Yes,
or
exactly. I mean,
stockbroker?
We started out in a training class, then I got my brokerage license, and then I was approached by the head of the municipal bond division. Why don't you come into the bond business? And I really didn't want to go down to open an office in Atlanta or down in Florida, so I took that job. So I got in the bond business, and I was a trader on the bond desk of the municipals. And then at some point, that led Smith Barney getting into the corporate bond market, and I transitioned over to corporate bonds. And then from there, they told me they would put me on commission, which they never did. And I got approached by a small boutique firm called Smithers, which was really known for their bond acumen and their bond business. So I went over and became a salesman doing corporate securities, corporate bonds at Smithers and Company.
I've often thought to be a good trader, you have to be pretty quick in your head with numbers to make sure you get the numbers right. Is that true? Or are you really
No,
good at that?
that is true, but I think as a salesman, much more so than a trader, that business is a commodity business. It's about relationships. So if you can build a relationship with your clients where they trust you and they go to you when they have business to do, that's how you become successful.
Okay, so how did Morgan Stanley hear of you and say you should join what was then considered a white shoe firm, and
No question
probably
about it.
hadn't hired a lot of Lebanese backed traders before, right?
Well, it's a good story. So I met with Dick Fisher, who was running that initiative to build a secondary bond business. And we went back and forth, and I said, Dick, I'm flattered that you would offer me a job, but I don't believe a Lebanese heritage from North Carolina who went to Duke University has a chance at making it Morgan Stanley. And he said, well, you're wrong. And if you think you come over here and you're right, when you quit, I will resign. I'm telling you, you're wrong. This is a meritocracy, and you should join us. He convinced me.
So in those days, Morgan Stanley was a private partnership, not a public company.
Correct.
And it was a company that basically underwrote, let's say, AT&T bonds, but it didn't actually go out and sell them.
Correct.
It would price them, and other people would sell them.
Right.
So Morgan Stanley said, we're now going to change that, and you became a trader for Morgan Stanley?
I became a salesman at Morgan Stanley. That's what they needed.
Right, so you did that for a while, and then at some point, people give you more authority, and you get to be in management. Did you want to be in management, or did you like to be a trader or salesman?
I like success. So I thought the right way to go was being a manager, and that's what I wanted to do. And whether there's a lot of disagreement if I were any good or not very good, I liked it, and I thought I was pretty good at it.
So you rose up, and you ultimately are offered the position of being the CEO of Morgan Stanley.
Well, yeah, eventually, but there were a lot of blocks along the way to do that.
But then all of a sudden, you decided you needed to do a merger with Dean Witter.
Right.
And why did you need to do that?
Well, Dean Witter was owned by Sears, and they had decided to spin it off. And Morgan Stanley got the order from Sears to do this transaction, to raise money in an equity transaction. So when we met with Phil Purcell and talked about all their salesmen, their branch offices, it became apparent to me and also to Dick Fisher that this is the way to really build the franchise, because distribution is going to be more and more important, and to have a connection with retail clients would be important. And that's how we made the decision. There was pushback in the firm, but with Parker Gilbert and Dick Fisher's leadership, we were able to convince the partners this is the right thing to do, and we did it.
So your firm was a leading Wall Street firm. You could argue Dean Witter was a so-called Main Street firm.
Correct.
And putting the two together had never been done like that before.
Correct.
And how did you negotiate who was going to be the CEO?
Well, at that time, Dean Witter owned Discover Card. So their market cap was dramatically larger than ours. So we based it on market cap, and they had a much larger market cap to do the deal. Purcell wanted to be in charge. That was one of the prerequisites to do the deal, that he'd be the CEO, and I'd be the president of the firm, and we did that deal.
All right, you did that deal, and being president under somebody else was a step back, you could argue, though it's a bigger firm. How long did that last?
David, that's a good question. I know it didn't last too long.
So ultimately, you said, I've had enough of this, and you didn't like his style, and you write about that in your book.
Yeah.
But you ultimately said, okay, I'm out of here. And
right.
so unemployed,
Yeah.
And you tell your wife, guess what? Your husband's unemployed.
Right. No, my wife is so supportive. I could have told her anything and she's on my side. It was great. You know, I ended up at one point kind of going to a hedge fund and working with Art Sandberg, and I did that for a while. But I was really flexible, and I think they call them the grumpy old men who went after the existing management at Morgan Stanley and felt like they were losing their edge and also their reputation as a really great investment bank, and really led by Parker Gilbert and Louis Bernard and some of the senior partners who had retired. And they owned a lot of stock, and they put a lot of pressure on Dean Witter, Morgan Stanley, to make a change, and that's how I ended up going back.
So Phil Purcell was ousted.
Right.
And then they came to you, and to your surprise, they said, come back and be the CEO. You hadn't known that you were going to be asked.
Correct. I didn't know that at all.
So what was it like when you came back? Were there people cheering for you when you came back into Morgan Stanley?
You've seen the film. Yes.
For a young person who now is looking at a career, would you recommend a Wall Street career today?
David, yeah, listen, there are not many jobs you can have as a young individual where you're always learning.
So how did you build Morgan Stanley? Were you focused on underwriting, trading, other areas that were new to Wall Street?
Well, I focused on what we did really well, and what we really did extremely well was build relationships with corporations and CEOs. We were either number one or number two in the M&A tables every year, so that was very important. And then we said, look, if we're going to be doing M&A and we have these wonderful relationships and trust, let's move into the secondary market and become a very active securities business. So we ended up building a very large platform at the institutional level. And over time, with Dean Witter, you had the retail. So we really focused on being an institutional firm with a very strong retail base.
Your predecessor, Phil Purcell, was famous for not meeting with a lot of people. He was a little isolated, some people accused him of being. You like to be on the trading floor or near the trading floor or being with customers all the time or with your employees, is that right?
Yes.
And so if you found people that were ignoring their clients or ignoring their employees, people working for you, you tended to tell them what you thought?
Without question. What I did when I was running the division, fixed income division, I would sit out on the trading floor and I had a glass booth office. So if I had needed to have a conversation with someone, instead of going off in the conference room, we could sit in this glass office and we'd have a conversation. And I would be on the phones. I'd walk around and sit down by the best salesman or the worst salesman. What are you working on? What are your clients doing? I was always involved. And I had some really fun times in doing it. I think in my book, I talk about how you treat people. And I get off the elevator at 8 o'clock in the morning or 7:45, and you look over to the right, and their delivery guys bringing coffee and egg sandwiches or whatever you do for breakfast. And about 20 minutes later, I walk back and I go out on the trading floor, and I go up to this guy and I said, how long have you been here? He said, about 30 minutes. He was Hispanic, about 30 minutes. I said, have you called the person that ordered breakfast? He said, yes, I've called him 3 times. I said, give me the number. So I gave him the number, and I said, this is John Mack. I want you to get your ass out here. And he comes out in front of the delivery guy. And I said, look, we're no better than he is. He's just trying to make a living. When you make him wait, you take money out of his pocket. If I ever hear about it again, you're fired. That went around the floor like that. You don't treat people that way. And I hope that's ingrained in me before I went to Morgan Stanley, but I really learned it from Dick Fisher. He was such a gentleman and very smart and made decisions.
So the person that you almost fired, did he do that again? Or
no, he didn't do it again. No one did it again.
So Morgan Stanley is doing quite well,
Right.
and Morgan Stanley is competing principally with Goldman Sachs, I guess was your main rival. And then all of a sudden, we go into a recession, 2007, 2008. So what happened was, as I remember from that period of time and from reading your book, you had this large cash reserve and you wanted to make sure you had a lot of cash, but people were afraid of Morgan Stanley maybe going under.
Right.
So they said, give me my cash back. I'm going to put it in JP Morgan.
That's exactly right.
And so all of a sudden the cash is going all the way down.
Right.
And at some point you say, maybe we're not going to make it.
That's exactly right. Well, thank God for the Japanese is what I can say. What I learned is it goes back to when Morgan Stanley would bring brokers from whether Nomura or Sumitomo, it didn't make any difference, and they would in a training program at Morgan Stanley. And the Japanese who came through that training program respected the culture of Morgan Stanley. So when we were on the brink, they stepped up and gave us the money to stay in business.
So it turned out to be a good investment for Mitsubishi because your stock has flourished since then. And after that happened, did you think that Wall Street learned any lessons? And do you think this could happen again, where you have enormous illiquidity problems or liquidity problems, and Wall Street really has changed very much?
Well, I think the business of Wall Street hasn't changed that much, but the scrutiny on capital and capital solvency is very, very focused. And I think the Fed does a much better job in paying attention to the liquidity of these investment banks. Also, I think boards of directors have elevated risk management to a level that never existed when I was there. So going through a near-death experience that we went through, and other firms, in some cases they actually died, like unfortunately Lehman Brothers, boards focus on risk management. It's not about what deal you did. It's not about, we're going to open another branch office. It's about liquidity and solvency.
So after this happened and Morgan Stanley comes back and is doing quite well, you ultimately decide to retire.
Right.
And you handed the reins over to James Gorman, who had not been a lifer at Morgan Stanley. And in fact, he had come from Merrill Lynch. You had recruited him from there. Right. And he was a consultant, not a trader, not an investment banking person. So was that controversial to give it to him?
If it were I never heard about anyone saying, how could you do that? James is smart. He knows the business. He spent time as a consultant, time at Merrill Lynch. I saw how he ran the business, our retail business at Morgan Stanley. He was on the management committee. I got a chance to see his interface. I would go up once a week and spend time in the office up in Westchester to be with him and how he managed. Smart as he can be, can make a decision, doesn't suffer fools, and he has a great personality. He was a natural.
So for a young person who now is looking at a career, would you recommend a Wall Street career today?
David, yeah, listen, there are not many jobs you can have as a young individual where you're always learning. It may be not something you can write, but Wall Street lives on the news and what people are doing and what are the trends. I don't know many businesses like that. If you go in the manufacturing business, you have a sales cycle, you hope it's doing well. But in Wall Street, you have data every day that tells you not only what's going on in this country, what's going on in the world.
So as you look at your career, what do you think you're the most proud of having done? Help with New York Presbyterian, help Morgan Stanley recover from some of its problems. What are you most proud of?
I'm most proud of where Morgan Stanley came from, just a few hundred people, to where it is now. I think taking the risks we took, doing the Dean Witter trade, having the bumps that we had to live with, it turned out to be an unbelievable investment bank with a great culture. And to have James Gorman running it now, I couldn't be happier or more proud of it.
So in hindsight, if you had to do it all over again, would you have gone to medical school as your mother wanted, or you're happy you became a Wall Street person?
To my mother's disappointment, thank God I came to Wall Street.